The world seems more politically polarised than ever. Ethical funds in major markets recorded record outflows earlier this year amid rhetoric about woke capitalism.
We're in a really complex, polarised world at the moment. People are coming to realise actually how you invest your money has real-world impacts.
Rapidly rising defence spending has some reconsidering companies that were once too hot to touch. At the same time, some are taking an even longer view and doubling down on sustainability, calling out asset managers that don't vote with environmental concerns in mind.
New Zealand is unique in that every quarter for the last 3 years, we've had positive inflows into sustainable funds.
So if funds are being forced to choose, how might your money be taking sides too? This week we're talking with a fund manager taking the high road with KiwiSaver contributions and managed assets. Before we hear more of that, some important information you should always consider when investing.
Investing involves risk. You might lose the money you start with. We recommend talking to a licensed financial advisor. We also recommend reading product disclosure documents before deciding to invest. Everything you're about to see and hear is current at the time of
Welcome, John
recording.
Berry.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Yeah, great to have you here. Look, the world seems very divided right now. Is money taking sides as well?
Yeah, look, you're right. We're in a really complex, polarised world at the moment. And I think historically people saw money just as, and investing as just, money is a store of value, money is a medium of exchange. But now people are coming to realise actually how you invest your money has real-world impacts, and it really matters for the choices you make on where you invest or where you don't invest.
Right. Quick reminder, what is ESG?
ESG. ESG is an acronym that stands for environmental, social and governance. And so we can take these factors into account with how we invest. Historically, it's sort of conventional thinking around ESG is how is it going to impact the future cash flows of a company? So if a company is governed well or governed poorly, what does that mean for the future value of the company? What does it mean for future cash flow? Am I going to make more money out of the company? Am I going to manage risk by taking ESG into account? And that's kind of different to ethical investing. Ethical investing says, yes, that's true. You've got to take these into account to manage risk and make more money. But ethical investing is also, let's put a values overlay on it. And what are values we want to take into account with investing around environmental issues or social issues, regardless of the cash flow impact on a company.
Right. So when Morningstar reported last year that there was a net drop in ESG funds, that there'd been a decline in just the number of funds operating out there from, I think, 646 to 587, does that suggest that there's some natural attrition going on, that these funds are just simply expiring or changing their shape or whatever, or that there's been some kind of political climate change around how appealing they are?
Yeah, I think there's a few things going on there. One is around labelling, particularly in Europe, where some managers may have been using the sustainable label and perhaps weren't so sustainable, so they were, under the rules in the EU, have relabelled them. So a lot of them disappeared because of the labelling issue. In part, yes, there are very complex geopolitical factors at play and that is influencing investment thinking. But the key thing, I think, is, which also comes out of Morningstar data, is New Zealand is unique in that every quarter for the last 3 years, we've had positive inflows into sustainable funds. That's quite unique in the world. Even Europe has had negative outflows for one quarter. But there is, this is more than a fad. It is actually a real thing, this move towards sustainable investing or ethical investing. Are
we late to the party? Are we mad? Are we just doing it our own way? What's the explanation for that?
I think it's, in my mind, it's because New Zealanders are really starting to understand and care deeply about environmental and social issues. So, when you look at what New Zealanders want or don't want in their investing, the research done by Mindful Money says that more than 80% of New Zealanders don't want environmental degradation, don't want human rights abuses, weapons or factory farming, for example. A whole collection of issues. More than 80% of New Zealanders don't want them in their investing. And that number has been very high for the last few years. So I think New Zealanders care quite deeply about how their money is invested.
If we talk a bit about Pathfinder, and for those that haven't heard of it, don't know it, what exactly are you and how do you stand out from the rest of the crowd?
So Pathfinder, we're a fund manager. We have a KiwiSaver, we have managed funds, And our mission as a business is to generate individual wealth and collective well-being by investing ethically. So we believe in this idea of duality. This is not philanthropy, ethical investing. We're here to make money for our investors. We believe you can do it in a way that not only avoids harm, but also has positive benefits for the world. And I suppose that's probably, we've been doing this for over a decade, and that probably is what differentiates us from other managers, is that deep belief in purpose and trying to bring that investment process into life.
If you look at your phone, a TV screen, anything like that at the moment, the pictures we're seeing are pretty horrific. We're seeing what feels like nightly reports on conflicts from two extremely volatile regions in the world, and the feeling that, goodness, it's all just getting worse and worse. How on earth does a fund manager like yourselves at Pathfinder try and navigate that?
Yeah, look, you're right. It is tough, and it's, for many people, there's a sense of despair and a loss of hope, and seeing, the conflict is very personal. Seeing it, and for us, we don't focus on a particular conflict and the two sides of the conflict and the politics of the conflict. We just focus on the use of weapons. And we want to avoid weapons. And you mentioned Gaza and Ukraine. There's also Democratic Republic of Congo, there's Sudan, there's Myanmar. Weapons are being used all around the globe. And tragically, it's not a new thing. If we look at the last 1,000 years of human history, there haven't been very long periods of peace in the world. And this conflict at the moment, the challenge is technology is getting cheaper and more novel in its use as a weapon. It's more accessible. And so as a fund manager, we need to think deeply about avoiding weapons and not being part of the economy of war.
But it's getting harder to do that, surely. And at the same time, some are saying, well, you need to balance this argument, obviously between responsible portfolios and delivering strong returns, but also the importance of defence and the challenges posed by the ways that you defend yourself, yeah?
Yeah. So the challenge is you don't get to choose if a weapon is used for defence, and for that reason, we'd rather not invest in weapons companies that make weapons if they can be used for offence or defence. What I'd say around the returns is, yes, weapons companies have had strong returns in the last 12 months. Weapons companies in the S&P 500, they are part of the industrial sector. They make up 2% of the market. So it's a relatively small part of the market. And an investor who's happy having weapons probably also has fossil fuels in their portfolio. Fossil fuels are almost 3% of the S&P 500. Fossil fuels have done terribly in the last 12 months. So yes, weapons have done well in the last 12 months. You've probably also got fossil fuels in the portfolio that haven't. They do kind of balance each other out. But, for us, we can't mitigate, the fact when we don't have weapons companies, we've missed out on that return from the weapons companies. But that is our choice as an ethical investor, is not to have those companies in there.
How then do you price or look at a company that's got mixed imperatives? A company like Boeing, for example, that has an entire defence component to its earnings, and yet also handles a lot of civilian aviation, provides humanitarian support, I suppose, if you look at the kind of the uses that some of that technology is put to. I mean, there'd be lots of other examples that you could probably potentially rope in a Rocket Lab or even companies like Ventia or Downers that are supplying. They're contracting to defence services to provide, base support, but at the same time, they're also possibly taking care of your local public park.
Yep.
How do you try and draw the line there?
It's complex. And so on the controversial weapons side, landmines, cluster munitions, zero tolerance, won't invest in that at all. Conventional military weapons, the challenge there is you're not just talking about a Lockheed Martin that designs and assembles the weapon. You're actually talking about hundreds, if not thousands, of companies in behind them that provide individual components that go into the weapon. So what we say is any company that generates more than 5% of revenue from selling into weapon systems, we won't invest in. So that if they're part of the componentry of building a weapon, then on top of that, you've got companies that provide services to military as well. So we found we were invested in a company that trained pilots, not only for civilian purposes, but trained military pilots. not a weapon, but they're getting revenue from military. We wouldn't invest in a military plane. Why would we invest in the company that trains people to fly it? So we set a limit of 50% there, and we said, okay, if they're providing services to military, if their core business is built around that, so more than 50% revenue, we won't invest. So it's sort of a scale of what the company is doing and how much revenue they're earning from that activity.
Is a lot of that freely available, the information to make those decisions?
Obviously, enormous amounts of data required. So we actually subscribe to data from a couple of offshore providers that will drill down into listed companies and where does the revenue come from. And so, yes, I mean, you can find articles on companies all over the place, but you can't individually search each company. You need aggregated data.
And I guess sort of really drilling in, and particularly, I suppose I'm just thinking, because we're still talking about the defence sector, a lot of that is inherently protected. It's kept confidential for various reasons. It's quite opaque to try and get your head around. So I imagine that's another potential hazard if you're considering investing in it, even if you think it's worthwhile, right? That it's very difficult to get a clear picture sometimes of what that company is doing, who its customers are, what its prospects are.
Yeah, that's true of a lot of companies that are, if you think of global corporates, they've got operations all over the place. They'll have different business divisions. Things like weapons or animal testing, they're often not very forthcoming on explaining it and making it the information readily available. So we're relying on specialist data sources to help us with that.
Wow. Okay. It sounds like quite a journey that you have to go on to really get it right and make sure that whatever is in your portfolio meets that labelling. Yeah.
Yeah. And look, we're not saying we're perfect all the time. And the other challenge is the world is changing at a really fast pace. And the question of what is a weapon is actually quite a hard one to answer, because traditionally you just think of a weapon as a tank and or a jet fighter or a gun. Mm. But now it's also AI and data centres and data processing are being weaponised. Is that a weapon? And, so the boundaries are getting much more complicated.
I guess if you're looking at some of the more kind of high-profile companies like Palantir, I don't know if I'm going to get in a lot of grief here with the people naming names, but there are companies that obviously have defence applications that are in the IT space, but also have tremendous cybersecurity applications. They're there to protect people in lots of different ways. How do you make a decision about that kind of thing? Is it just that simple 5%?
It comes down to the 5% revenue threshold. Right. And then you've got other companies as well that may produce something for civilian purposes, and that gets repurposed or weaponised. And, good example is Caterpillar bulldozers. The Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world, a $2 trillion fund, massive fund, divested from Caterpillar a week ago on the basis that their equipment was being used in Gaza for demolition, effectively weaponised, and the company was not doing enough to stop that. Pathfinder, we actually divested Caterpillar in November 2023, but large investors like in Norway are going down that pathway as well.
I guess if we look at a different kind of a conflict in the political climate, literally around climate, you're seeing a lot of talk about countries looking at the Paris Accord and whether they want to renegotiate that or pull out of it. The US has. I think maybe Eritrea and Yemen and a couple of others have too. New Zealand's discussing this now. I don't know how seriously. Yep. It's being raised in the political debate. What sort of uncertainty does that create?
Yeah, you're right. It has been floated recently. Should New Zealand renegotiate or withdraw? What I've seen is, and again, we need certainty of the rules on what is applying and into the future, so businesses can plan around that. I've seen farmers advocates and our Prime Minister say we'd be mad to pull out of Paris. And the reason for that on economic grounds is there would be retaliation against New Zealand. It is baked into our trade agreements with the European Union. There would be problems for us selling product into the European Union if we pulled out. It makes no economic sense to do that, let alone putting aside the climate argument, just on economic grounds, it would not be good for New Zealand.
But again, you're seeing a lot of this kind of sovereign risk effect, I suppose. Here they're talking about it with regards to whether or not some of those big power generating companies that are on a renewables path, but also are still, using a bit of coal, may or may not be broken up. You look in the States, all kinds of measures to support green technology and solar and so on were sort of pushed aside in that One Big Beautiful Bill Act. Makes it really complicated to make a decision about what is actually a safe investment, even if you're trying to invest sustainably, responsibly, ethically, however you want to put it?
Yeah, look, on that front, you're right. The One Big Beautiful Act, was hard on renewables companies, the renewables sector. But the reality is the world is transitioning to a lower carbon future. And so, we can't turn off fossil fuels today and expect civilization to function, but we have to recognise we are transitioning and we have to reallocate capital to renewables and lower carbon future. And those companies are going to thrive long term. That's where the money's going to be made. There is investment going into fossil fuels globally. I would question the sanity of a lot of that investment, given on a 10, 20-year horizon, a lot of those assets may have no value. As we decarbonise, they may not be as useful as they are now. They may have a short time horizon.
So is that the sort of time horizon that Pathfinder uses, 10, 20 years?
Well, with our setting the our vision for the future, so our vision is to fund the transformation to a better world. We were thinking 100 years future when we described the world in 100 years we want and what that means for distribution of wealth, what it means for ecosystems. How fast that transition will happen? Well, it needs to happen faster rather than slower to keep within the boundaries that the planet can cope with. But it's not going to happen within years. It is going to be within decades.
There's also been some research, I think, recently around people's appetite for this kind of thing. Something like 49% of investors that Mindful Money were talking to were saying, hey, look, we would consider a switch to ethical in 5 years. What does that even mean? I mean, surely if you think something is worthwhile, you're going to get into it now. Yep. And if you're saying in 5 years, that's like we should catch up for a coffee. It's like it's not going to happen. How real is that appetite, do you think?
So with that survey, it was actually within the next 5 years. So not in in 5 years' time, but within the next 5 years. And I think that just reflects people are time poor at the moment. They realise they need to do a lot of research to weigh up the options, and they know it's complex and nuanced. And at the moment, when it comes to money, mortgages, household budgets probably take priority over thinking about, am I going to move my KiwiSaver to another provider, for example? It's something on their radar, but it may not be an immediate priority. So I think part of it is about time. Part of it is not knowing where to get the right research and trusting the research, because it's quite a big decision to make to move in line with your values. And I'll just encourage people to go to the website which did the research, which is mindfulmoney.nz. Independent. They do all the thinking for you in terms of the transparency of the holdings, what may be in a KiwiSaver that's good or bad, and providing returns and feed information as well. So they've done the thinking and provided the data there. I just encourage people to visit that website to accelerate the 5 years to something closer to now. You
mentioned trust, it's an important thing, and you mentioned labelling, that's an important thing too. I just wanted to mention that you had a few words with the regulator, the FMA, last year around an issue that they'd picked up.
Yep.
And I can paraphrase it or you can talk, but basically they'd said, hey, yours was a completely ethical product, and then there was a bit of a reference to a couple of particular companies that were in the portfolio that had engaged in limited animal testing.
Yeah,
so, and also there was an exemption or a carve-out for Contact, because although it does thermal coal, you felt it was on a track, but you hadn't kind of made that super clear. Is that what was the problem? Yeah, look, please, and thank you for raising that. If you think about investing, there's sort of three sides to what we do. There's the policy of how we invest and our ethical approach. There's our portfolio of what we're actually invested in. And the third limb is how we talk about it and how we tell people about it. And we let ourselves down with how we talked about it and told people about it. And the example you gave was Contact. Our investment policy says we won't invest in fossil fuel exploration, production, or companies that burn coal to produce electricity. We made an exemption for Contact Energy on the basis that it generates power through burning fossil fuels. However, they have a pathway to net zero, and it's a credible pathway. They're regarded as a leader in the world around decarbonisation. In our advertising, we explain we don't invest in fossil fuel companies. We should have said either mention the Contact. Little asterisk. Yeah, little asterisk and mention Contact, or we should have just said
fossil fuel extraction and production, but we had that exception for fossil fuel. Similarly with animal testing, we ran some advertising that said we don't invest in companies that test on animals. We have granted a small number of exceptions, and often they're in what we call the transformational bucket, which is a company that's producing synthetic skin. But unfortunately, to prove so this is going to do away with the use of animal products in the future. But to prove the product works, they need to test it on animals. So we've granted them an exception on the basis that their product is transformational and will change that category in the use of animal products.
So that's a long horizon approach rather than just sort of looking at the immediate movements.
Yeah. But like you say, we should have mentioned at the asterisks and talked about that in our advertising.
As an ethical fund manager, I suspect that your investors aren't just looking for return. They want you to vocalise that in the kind of votes that you make or the kind of communications you have with the company.
And the way we talk to companies, the way we invest. And that's a challenge from the perspective of there is no perfect company. So every company you invest in has both good attributes and bad attributes, and you need to make trade-offs between the two. And I'll give you an example of Tesla. So Tesla, we invested in years ago because we loved the mission of Elon Musk to essentially drive decarbonisation, not just of the car you have in the garage, but of transport. And so he was leading in the transport, in the decarbonisation electrification space.
And creating batteries in just about every driveway, right? So that's a whole other thing that's happening too, yeah?
So there's that powerful drive, but you look at the company from an ESG perspective, like governance, pretty bad governance, right? It's one person who's controlling the show and is always going to lead to trouble in large companies. Environmental and social issues around supply chain, for example, and where you get the rare earths and minerals from. We sort of weighed that the mission, outweighed the ESG harms, but more recently we've said actually other car companies are now catching up to Tesla and have followed that leadership. We don't need to invest in the company with the concerns we have around. So we actually sold it earlier this year. You
have sold all your Tesla?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
What are you buying?
What are we buying? Oh, look, we've got, there's plenty of tech companies, Mag 7, there's fantastic opportunities there, but Tesla is no longer in the portfolio.
Wow. Big moment. If I can turn just back locally again, we've sort of got an interesting political climate, I would say, where you've got a lot of phrases thrown around about red and green tape. And I think one of the parties has had a crack at woke lending, the idea that banks have got both climate-related disclosures, but also maybe lending preferentially on broadly green or renewable topics, and that might be costing others who don't want to necessarily undertake that kind of lending. All of that sort of stuff, does that send, what sort of a message do you think that sends to potential investors that are looking at New Zealand? And from your point of view as a fund manager, do you have anything to say about that?
The political environment is complicated and polarised globally, and we're seeing parts of that in New Zealand as well. What do international investors think of New Zealand? Sure, they're interested in New Zealand because we're safe, secure, politically stable, legal system is robust, we're perceived as green. But the challenge on the flip side is we're less than 0.2% of global equity markets. And when you look at our listed companies, we've got a lot of infrastructure and power companies, but we're really lacking in high growth tech companies in our listed markets. So for international investors, we're interesting, but we're kind of at the margins. Where I think they're interested is in the private market space. There's a lot going on in New Zealand with private companies, green technology, space, SaaS companies, some really, really interesting companies in New Zealand, and they're attracting international attention and capital.
And is that the kind of thing that Pathfinder is also exploring opportunities with, either from the funds management side or even from the KiwiSaver side? Because we're seeing a little bit more private equity exploration there by some of those KiwiSaver funds, aren't we?
Yeah, look, I've been an advocate for over a decade for KiwiSaver investing into private assets. Long before I had a KiwiSaver or ran Pathfinder KiwiSaver, I think it's great for NZ Inc. to create jobs and drive innovation and keep our talented people in the country. It's also great from a investment and portfolio perspective for KiwiSaver investors long-term to have access to this asset class. So yes, at Pathfinder, we're invested in great companies, New Zealand companies like Mint Innovation, which extracts metals from e-waste, Lodestone, which is producing solar energy for New Zealand, the cheapest energy source in New Zealand. There's a host of social housing. We've invested in several social housing projects, commercial return, but at the same time, this great social benefit.
None of them are listing. None of them look like they ever will list, to be quite honest. I mean, is that a problem, that we're not getting that kind of IPO level disclosure and exposure so that people can take a very clear look at the market, and a bit of liquidity in there as well?
Yeah, and look, hopefully some of them will list and choose to list in New Zealand rather than list in Australia. But from a KiwiSaver perspective, because they're private assets and they're not liquid, they can only ever be a small part of a KiwiSaver. So for us, it's around 5% of our KiwiSaver is in these private assets. But because of the portability of KiwiSaver, everyone can transfer their KiwiSaver to another provider at any time. It's appropriate for it to be. It's important, but it's a small part of the KiwiSaver.
Would you like to see that twitched or changed at all slightly, just a little bit? That 5%, or is that 5%? That's a market.
Sorry, that's what we set. That's what we set, and because there is no guidance in New Zealand around, so providers like us and several other providers are really focused on the private asset space. We're sort of trying to work out what is the right level. We've been quite conservative at setting at 5%.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that there's some data out on KiwiSaver as a scheme broadly across the board just today. 175,000 transfers within schemes in the last year. That's probably the highest it's ever been. So people are switching. They are making more definite choices about where they want to place their KiwiSaver. Yeah. Are you seeing people go or people come?
We're seeing people come. Yeah, absolutely. We're seeing people join Pathfinder. So every month for us, we get new people joining, and I'm pleased to say our churn rate, which is people leaving, is way lower than the market average for Pathfinder.
So the stats out, I think KiwiSaver funds as at would have been end of March probably, 123 billion invested, which is pretty sizable sort of a figure.
Yeah.
1.56 of that in what you would call socially responsible, according to the definition that the FMA provided. That seems like quite a small number. We're talking about 1% of KiwiSaver funds being in socially responsible funds. Yep. Do you see that picture when you look across the market?
No, look, I don't see that picture, and I question the categorisation that's being used to come up with 1.5%. I believe the number is much higher than
1.56 billion, I think. But anyway, yeah.
Okay, so that's that's a little over 1% then. Look, I would say it's much higher than that. At Pathfinder, we're a smaller provider with about 550 million in KiwiSaver, but the values-driven, sustainability-driven KiwiSaver choices of New Zealanders is a much higher number than that. And I think it's borne out in the Mindful Money research we talked about. 20% of Kiwis, in responding to the survey, are saying they're invested in ethical or sustainable funds. That doesn't quite match up with the FMA's categorisation.
Yeah, I mean, according to them, there are 3 times as many, 4.6 billion in cash.
Right.
I mean, it's easy to count cash, right? Cash is cash.
Yeah.
But I guess your definition of what's a socially responsible fund might be a bit trickier, and that takes us back to where we started, right?
Yeah, look, it's how do you label it, and it's not just the labelling, it's actually the reality of what is in that fund, and how is that fund invested, what are the values that are driving the investment process.
Again, KiwiSaver, just in the last little while, suddenly become a political football. You've got one of the big parties saying, hey, we want to make it compulsory, we want to take it to 10%. They're not quite clear on the details, the costs. Is there a risk there if people tinker with KiwiSaver that it kind of kills some of that ability to transform the economy, to lift people's savings and to provide that potential capital into those private assets that you're talking about?
Yeah, I think consistency of the rules around KiwiSaver is really, really important, because people need confidence of what the rules are and understanding when they can access it. So you can open your KiwiSaver at 65. It's really important people have that certainty and know their contributions will be accessed and it will provide for them in retirement. The the increase to 10% that one of the parties has floated. In Australia, it's 12% is the contribution from employers, which is why their balances are so high in Australia, which is why Australians are probably going to have a better retirement than New Zealanders. We need to lift the savings rate in New Zealand. We've got to be careful how we do that, where the burden falls. I'm not sure in a cost of living crisis that people can afford to put much higher contributions into their KiwiSaver, and equally it's a burden you can't shift it all onto the employer. So the best way to do it is, in my mind, is actually come up with a 10-year plan and say over the next 10 years we're going to be increasing contributions, this is what it looks like, and step it out in a really gentle, really well-planned, well-signalled way.
And try and get everybody to sign up to agree to it along the way. Good luck with that.
Well, I don't think people necessarily disagree with we need to save more for retirement. It's just where does the burden fall and over what time period? And that's what we need to be really clear about, is the fairness of the sharing and spreading it over a long time period.
It's a lot to think about. Thank you, John, and thank you all for your time, whether you were watching or listening. We know that time is precious, and we want to know what you thought about this, so let us know. For us, kumatu, that's shared lunch for now.